many of you know that video by heart by now, huh? Excellent, excellent video. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this panel on the theaters of global jihad. We have a really fabulous panel of speakers here, and we're going to do something that I really think is necessary in the last day of any conference, and that is we're going to try and speak a little bit shorter than usual. There's still quite a few of us to speak, so it'll take us a little bit of time to get through the presentations, but then we're going to try and maximize as much time as possible for questions and answers and dialogue between all of us in recognition of the fact that there are many more experts in the audience at a conference like this than there are even up here. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Yossi Mann is the chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Ilan University and a researcher here at the Institute of Policy and Strategy at IDC. Eitan Azani is the Deputy Executive Director here at ICT and the head of its BA and MI specializations in counterterrorism. Milo Comerford is an analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in the UK. Stephen Tankel is an assistant professor at American University and a senior editor at War on the Rocks and the author of a brilliant new book. Zelin is the Richard Borow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a fellow in the counterterrorism program there along with myself, and the author of a variety of studies, including a new forthcoming one on Tunisia and foreign terrorist fighters. And Jacob Zenn is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and a fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Last and very much least, I am Matt Levitt. I direct the counterterrorism program at the Washington Institute and also am an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. So let's jump right into it. Yossi, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. Set the stage a little bit. 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Yossi Mann. I'm the head of the Middle Eastern Department in Ilan University. Actually, starting from the next academic year, I'll be the head of the Middle East program here in the IDC. My topic is quite different from the other members here. I'm mainly dealing with the economic aspect of the Middle East, and in specific the commodities market. I'm also a partner in a commodities trading company, so I'll try to bring you both my practical and theoretical experience regarding the oil market and how terror is influencing the markets in general and the oil market in specific. So let me start with a short brief regarding the oil market. So oil market was quite volatile during the past 2 years. It increased by 100% in the last two years. It was around $33 a barrel in WTI, and then right now it's almost $65 a barrel. We consume around 96 million barrels a day. We produce around 97 million barrels a day, which means that every geopolitical event can cause a deficit in the production, and therefore quite an energy crisis. So it's quite obvious there is a correlation between terror and oil price. Any effect on the production can cause a crisis. But that's very obvious. What I'm trying to argue is actually in the last few years there is less correlation between what's happening in the geopolitical arena and oil prices. The oil prices are more influenced by sentiment, okay, and not by, I would say, fundamentals. So we might think that there is a strong correlation between terror and oil prices, but actually the sentiment is more powerful. For example, President Trump tweets has much more impact on the price than the Houthi missiles that they shot through the Saudi oil tankers like 3 weeks ago. So I'll try to divide the three threats on the oil market into three categories. The first threat is a direct threat. Okay, so there is a direct threat on the on oil infrastructure by shooting missiles on tankers, by putting bombs on the refineries, or protests in Eastern province in Saudi Arabia, or like in Libya when they block the oil fields, or their sabotage against the oil wells in Libya. So that's a direct impact on the price. And I would say that between 2011, as you can see here, and 2014, there was a huge impact on the price because of terror attacks, mainly because what happened in Libya. Libya is still a very crucial factor in the industry, and because of lake production, there is some effect on the price. However, I would say that the market land after a while, that because of the Libyan situation, they were looking for other alternatives, and therefore any terror attack in Libya is no longer affecting the price like it was between 2011 and 2014. The other thing that I would like to say is that during the past few years, we use more technology in order to assess any terror attack. For example, in the past, when was there a terror attack, the impact was quite long. Nowadays, after 2 hours or 3 hours, we can say how big is the hole in the pipeline, how big is the effect of the terror attack, and therefore the effect of terror attack on oil infrastructure is much more limited than years before. I would say like 4 years ago, when any attack on oil infrastructure had a huge impact on the price. Right now, any attack can be assessed in 2 hours, and therefore the traders know how to translate the effect into price. The second category is the impending threat. That's the most crucial threat, because it means that there is a feeling that there is a threat on the market, and it's very complicated to assess what kind of a threat, how big is the threat. And I'll give you a few examples about the impending threat. For example, the ISIS attack on Kirkuk was considered as an impending threat, meaning that people were afraid that ISIS will attack Kirkuk and conquer Kirkuk, and therefore they will take their responsibility over the oil fields in northern Iraq. So this is a kind of impending attack. Another example is what happened in Syria, like a year ago, when President Trump said he will attack, and actually he attacked in Syria. But the market were expecting that because of this attack, there will be huge impact on the ground, that more terror organization will act against oil infrastructure, and therefore the prices went by $10. But right after the attack, the prices collapsed. The third one is the terror attack against the consumer. I would say that the terror attacks in Europe, in Paris and London and Belgium, had quite a small impact on the price. What happened is that the markets were afraid that because of these attacks, less tourists will come to these capitals, and therefore there was a small increase in the price. But in my opinion, as I said in the beginning, I think the market learned each one of these threats. They learned that not every missile can impact the price. Not every sabotage in tanker can influence the whole market, because right now we are in oversupply. I have 2 more points, because I'm limited in time, to say regarding the correlation between oil and the terror. The first thing is that we sometimes exaggerate the terror position in the oil trade. For example, between 2011 and 2014, ISIS hold around 100,000 barrels a day. They hold area that produce around 100,000 barrels a day, which sound a lot. Okay, if you translate into money, how much is it in cash? It means that around $1 billion, which is quite a lot for a terror organization. But if you think about the territory that they hold, it was around 8 million people who were living under this territory. So earning $1 billion for a terror organization or a state which runs terror, it's not so big. And if you think about the production of Saudi Arabia, which is around 10.5 million barrels a day, it's quite nothing. So I think we exaggerate the position that the terror organization have, the impact that the terror organization have on the price, and we should remember that they hold very limited amount of oil fields on wells in the Middle East and in general in other places. The other thing is very interesting that we found out that between 2011 and 2014, ISIS and the Kurds were trading between each other. At the same time that they were fighting against each other. The ISIS were selling crude oil to the Kurds, and they refined it into product. That's a very interesting phenomenon, that enemies can trade in oil although they fight against each other. And I'm mentioning it because, in my opinion, this is what will happen with Iran. After a while, the market will find ways to smuggle the oil, to trade with Iran, because oil is like a huge pool. Everybody extract from the same pool. Okay, so therefore, after a while, the market will find out ways how to bring oil even from Iran or from terror entities. And this is the most important conclusion, that although we might think that terror has impact, or terror organizations have an impact on the price, actually, after a while, the terror organization will join the club of oil-producing countries or entities, and there will be oversupply and not a risk, and therefore the prices will fall after a while and would not increase. And you can find it in every graph that after ISIS conquered some parts of Iraq or Syria, the prices went up. But after a while, the market found out that they are selling products and selling crude, and therefore the prices went down. Therefore, I think there is no strong correlation between terror and oil prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'll be talking about jihadist hotspots in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa to be specific. Before I get into my one and only slide, let me also mention there are, of course, other conflicts and types of violence in sub-Saharan Africa today beyond the jihadist hotspots that I'll talk about today. Like xenophobic violence in South Africa, or some border clashes even in Cameroon, the Anglophone, Francophone clashes, and a lot of militias and warlords in DRC. But jihadist conflicts are qualitatively different, for one, because the targeting often involves Western or international interests as well, and because when the jihadists, if they achieve their goals, then they're actually looking for a completely different type of regime. It's not just one government, one insurgent toppling the government and then continuing with the general policy. and because the jihadis are part of a different movement. So that's why you can actually look at jihadi conflicts in a unique context compared to other violence in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, even though I'm talking about jihadist hotspots, it's also important to mention that it's not necessarily helpful to only look at Africa as a conflict-ridden continent. If you look at the media, it's commonly associating Africa with conflict and jihadism, but not every country or region in the world necessarily looks at sub-Saharan Africa that way. I mean, right now, China is holding a massive conference with virtually all leaders in Africa, talking mostly about economics, and you can Google it or YouTube it today. And they're just talking about making money and building infrastructure. And so it's just not the case that every country in the world is looking at the continent in that way. It's probably decreased a little bit in recent years due to the turmoil in Turkey, but countries like Turkey and Qatar, they were pretty active in recent years in sub-Saharan Africa, in my view, mostly on sort of the NGO, charity front, soft power Islamism influence, which is qualitatively different probably from the Wahhabi Saudi influence in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 2 decades, which has probably waned, including because of MBS's generally new foreign policy of Saudi Arabia. Russia's getting more involved in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're probably a little bit closer to what the U.S. involvement is like. Russia's involved in arms sales, especially to countries where the U.S. won't deal with because of human rights concerns. And then we have the U.S., just to give another example. And the U.S. is, of course, very involved in sub-Saharan Africa in development and these types of educational, anti-corruption initiatives. But of course, counterterrorism. It's probably the first or second bullet point in any meeting between the U.S. government and official in Africa to talk about counterterrorism, which I think does lead to a little bit of a risk for the U.S. that we are going to end up becoming the fire extinguisher for the entire continent for the long term. And the question is just to what end? Are we just going to be putting out fires that other people benefit from? How are we going to use some of the innovativeness of the U.S. to actually boost the economies of sub-Saharan Africa and the U.S. as well? We've been trying to get involved with like Facebook and social media and those types of relationships with Africa beyond only a security relationship, and we'll see if that develops. So now I'll move on to talking about the different types of jihadi conflicts that I see. I would classify them into 3 different styles, and this is not supposed to be encompassing of all the jihadi activity in sub-Saharan Africa, but the first I would call the consolidation, which I refer to as northern Mali, northeastern Nigeria, and south-central Somalia. And these are places that are basically have broken, they've fallen apart. And the jihadis are there, and I don't know if you're a follower on Twitter or read his books, but Nassim Taleb has a heuristic which says that an entity that has existed for a certain amount of time has therefore a life expectancy of that same amount of time. So IDC has been around since 1994, so that's my math is terrible, but that's 24 years. So you can expect IDC to be around 24 more years. In 1996, when IDC was only 2 years old, it's still just beginning, you can only have a life expectancy for 2 years. So what does that heuristic mean for these conflicts? Well, Boko Haram's been fighting its insurgency since 2009, arguably since 2002. The Al-Shabaab issue is on an evolution since 1991. Mali fell apart only about 4 or 5 years ago. So you can expect these conflicts to at least last as long as they've lasted already, and very possibly longer. And what does that mean? In my view, it means that when you do an initiative to fix these problems, you need to almost have a horizon on your project implementation for as long as the conflict has already existed. So when I did a project in Nigeria with the EU, we had like 18 months with a 6-month extension. But we need to look at Boko Haram as a conflict that should at least be around for another 10 more years. So we need to have very long-term project planning. And the main issue with these 3 C's, the places where jihadism has consolidated, is that these places are broken. It's like a Humpty Dumpty problem. And it's very hard to fix a place once it's broken. Anyone who's working on Mosul or Iraq will know that. It's much easier to actually put in your marbles before a place becomes broken than trying to fix it. And how do you fix a place like northeastern Nigeria where all the schools, all the roads are completely fallen apart. You need to not only rebuild it, but you need to combat Boko Haram. And the same issues within northern Mali. Now, why did these places become broken? I mean, this is a very complicated issue beyond my 10-minute allotment. And I think there's not one reason for each place. For example, Somalia, why did it fall apart in 1991? I think it's probably more because of structural factors, like the end of the Cold War, not the US and Soviet Union didn't have that key need to balance it for geopolitical reasons against each other. And when the regime fell in 1991, it just fell into militia violence. In contrast, I don't see those geopolitical, structural factors as much at play in northeastern Nigeria in the Boko Haram case. As much as people will cite poverty, hunger, marginalization, lack of education, lack of literacy, climate change, in the case of Boko Haram, I don't think there had to be an insurgency there. I don't think it was nearly inevitable. I think it was more of an agency problem. In that case, I think it was more ideological. I think there was a group of individuals that determined that the Nigerian government was an infidel government because of ruling by the constitution and democracy, and this was opposed to the Wahhabi creed that they learned abroad. So they decided to establish a jihadi movement, and it really didn't have to do with these factors like poverty. And of course, the Nigerian government crackdown on them helped accelerate their cause, without doubt. But the problem was in Nigeria, which is similar to the case of AQIM's origins, was actually Boko Haram was gaining so much popularity before the government cracked down on them violently in 2009 that if the government did not crack down upon them, they probably would have achieved some type of political power on their own through their dawah, through their preaching. And Boko Haram's motto, even before the insurgency began in 2009, one of their mottos was, our dawah, our preaching, is for jihad, and jihad is not peaceful. And they were getting a lot of members, and the reason why the government cracked down in 2009 is because they knew that if Boko Haram kept on preaching, then they would be able to seize the mosques and end up seizing power in a certain way. So, I mean, that's sort of an ideological problem, and we can talk about how to have combated a group whose preaching was like Boko Haram in 2009, and yet it was very popular. In the case of Mali, another consolidated conflict, I think that was largely actually a spillover issue. It's not coincidental that the Libyan war happened in 2011 and Mali fell apart in 2012. You had mercenaries and weapons coming from Libya, and it upset an already somewhat unstable peace in Mali. Because typically there had been a cycle of violence in Mali. Every 10 years, the Tuaregs in the north had issues with the government in the south, and then they would have some type of civil war, and it would be resolved. And it was secessionist nationalists in the north. But once Libya happened, it completely disturbed that stable instability that was typical of Mali, and Mali hasn't been able to recover in the north. So I'll talk now about the other three conflicts, which I describe as spillover, particularly Niger and Burkina Faso. Those countries are now suffering a lot of attacks, but it's mostly happening on the border of Niger and Burkina Faso. In fact, attacks by the AQIM affiliate in Mali are now reaching the border of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And again, when we talk about the factors of jihadist violence, as poor as Niger is, much as climate change is hurting the environment, almost all the attacks are just on the border between Mali and Niger. The problem with Niger and Burkina Faso is the conflict is spilling over from Mali. So if you don't want Niger to become a C on that map in the future, the key is to prevent spillover and then Niger collapsing and then you having the Humpty Dumpty problem. The same is the case in Burkina Faso. And trust me, the border of Burkina Faso is getting hit so hard every week. And if things continue, they'll end up making it to the capital and causing problems. Lastly, before I close, I'll talk about the E, which is expansion. And these are sort of new jihadi hotspots that they're not really ripe for any spillover or consolidation, but we're seeing jihadist movements emerging. The model is in these places that I noted as E, such as Northeast DRC, Senegal, and Northern Mozambique, is probably similar to the model you see in Europe, where you have a very few radical preachers radicalizing a very large amount of people. For example, in places like Barcelona, you might have 3 imams that radicalize 30 people, as opposed to 10 imams radicalizing 3 people. And so in Senegal, you had a lot of Senegalese, like several dozen, go to Libya. But most of them were connected to just 2 or 3 imams. Of course, Wahhabi imams. And it seems like you see that same thing in Mozambique. So the sea in which the jihadis swim there is actually not very ripe, but there's still a few nodes that are able to recruit jihadis, and the key is to prevent that from actually expanding. But it's worthy to keep an eye on these places like Senegal, Senegal and northern Mozambique. And I'll conclude by noting that if you check the literature on a place like Nigeria from 10 years ago in 2008, what all the scholars were writing, they would say, fundamentalism in Nigeria, not a big concern, just a social movement wanting some reform. Nobody really had any expectation that Nigeria could become like it is today. And of course, the government's crackdowns have accelerated jihadism. But I feel like that's how we talk about places like Senegal or northern Mozambique today. Just some small elements of radicalized individuals. It's very similar to the way people talked about Nigeria 10 years ago. And now we see that Nigeria was the top place of terrorism conflict 2 years ago. So I wouldn't underestimate the potential for these places that now look like they might be pretty peaceful to end up becoming completely different in a not long time from now. And I look forward to questions later. Thanks.
Apparently I only get 7 minutes. So we're going to be traveling slightly north from West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa, and I'm going to talk about North Africa. So one of the things I think to contextualize to note compared to other jihadi zones like Syria, which most people are familiar with, I would imagine, is that there isn't a sectarian angle in North Africa, and there's less overt hostility between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And you don't see open conflict between these two groups like you do in Syria. Each group more or less does its own thing within the North African sphere. I'd also argue that unlike the Sahel region, which Jacob just spoke about, the outlook is much different in North Africa than there, where I think there's a lot more activity and negative trends in the Sahel than there is in North Africa. While this might be surprising to some, since many people always talk about Tunisians and Libyans, I would actually argue that jihadism within North Africa right now, if you look at their activities and operations, is at its lowest point since the Arab uprisings. So that's a good thing. That's not to say, though, that jihadis aren't operating or planning, and there's still more going on now than there was prior to 2011. But if you look at sort of the periods from 2011 to 13, and then 2014 to 16, where you saw a lot of activity first in relation to the Ansar al-Sharia movements, which are mainly dawah-based and outreach and preaching, to the more ISIS-related stuff, which was more violent. You don't see too much of that. So what happened and why is that? If you look at the operating environment in Tunisia, it changed a lot in 2014 after Nida Tunis came into power, which is the secular left party in comparison to Ennahda, which is the Islamist party, in power from 2011 to 2014. But even more so after the Sousse attacks in 2015, you started to see a major crackdown on individuals. And just to contextualize this, the last time I looked through data in early August, so I looked at the first 2 weeks of August for a forthcoming article with Charles Lister, Middle East Institute. Should hopefully be out in the next week. In the 2 weeks, they arrested 17 people, so that's at least one person a day that they're arresting for jihadism, and that's 3 years after the Sousse attacks. So even though we haven't really seen too many terrorist attacks in the last 2 years, there still are people being arrested, and the Tunisian state has been very proficient in that regard. And I'd like to thank the Tunisian state for actually being relatively transparent about putting out information and data on this. Another factor is, unsurprisingly, the fall of IS's territory in certain December 2016. And in relation to Iraq and Syria, the fall of territory there as well hindered the ability for IS to operate in Libya as well, since they were getting a lot of financial support from the core in Iraq and Syria. Therefore, individuals are still interested, but it's a lot more difficult nowadays to recruit and get people involved. So if you look at Libya first, earlier this year in Derna, which was essentially one of the last bastions of jihadism in the country in terms of control of territory, you had this Al-Qaeda front group or Al-Qaeda adjacent group, however you want to describe it, Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen. They were in control of the territory for some time, and due to the events of Khalifa Haftar's campaign against jihadism in Libya, he cleared the area a couple of months ago, and therefore there is no longer any area in Libya that has some kind of territorial control by jihadi groups. That being said, more Al-Qaeda-linked groups are based in southern Libya, and they use it for training. They also use it for moving individuals between North Africa and the Sahel region, where there are more prospects, especially in places like Mali, as Jacob noted. And then more in the central part of the country, I would argue you see elements of IS, where you have these roving and mobile training camps where they'll move to different areas over time, and it's very hard to track just because once you get south of a lot of the major cities, it's pretty much just open desert. And we've seen them picking up attacks, though. One of the things to note is that in 2017, there were 7 attacks by IS, and so far this year there have been 10 attacks by IS in Libya. So they're on a pace to double that. Obviously, it's not as severe or as acute as we saw when they're in control of territory, but it does illustrate that the group has gotten slightly stronger than it was in the aftermath of the fall of their territory. So it is something to look forward to in the future, as something that people should, pay attention to and not dismiss, even though it's not nearly as acute as it once was. In terms of Tunisia, so if you look at Katibat Uqba bin Nafi first, which is the Al-Qaeda group based on the Algerian-Tunisian border, they've more or less remained sort of this low-level insurgency since they began attacking the Tunisian state in December 2012. They haven't really grown much larger, but they haven't also either really been degraded all that much either. They've continued this relatively low pace of attacks, but if you look at the broader trends over a few years, you have seen somewhat of a degradation. So in 2015, you saw them having 6 attacks. In 2016, they had 5 attacks. In 2017, they had 3 attacks, and so far this year, they had 2 attacks. So it's more or less in line with the broader trends of it's relatively going down, but there's still stuff every, 3, 4, 5 months maybe. And the thing to note about Katibat Uqba bin Nafi, which is an AQIM front group, is that unlike IS, which has focused on conducting attacks on civilians and broader tourist infrastructure in Tunisia, Uqba bin Nafi is mainly focused on just attacking the security forces in the military. Though there are some interesting cases where they have attacked some shepherds in the mountainous regions, but part of that is because they wanted to get supplies and stores so that they could survive, since it really isn't that strong of an entity in many ways. In terms of IS within Tunisia, not specifically the cell that was based in Sabratha on the other side of the border in Libya, we've seen a similar general trend downward in terms of overall operational pace. So in 2015, when the group was at its peak in Tunisia, they had 11 attacks, including some of the more known ones like the one against the Borough Museum, the one against the beach, as well as the one against the presidential guard bus. In 2016 and 17, you saw 4 attacks in Tunisia by IS. And this year, thus far, we've seen 3 claimed attacks. So as you can see, generally speaking, it has gone down. In terms of sort of the ideological messaging and justification for what's going on and how they're able to try and continue operating and bringing people in, one of the biggest pulls from the North African sphere was the idea of the state and the caliphate. So it's definitely made it less advantageous now that IS no longer controls territory in Libya. But they are attempting unique ways to appeal to individuals. So one of the things in both Tunisia and Libya was that there were elections earlier this year in Tunisia, and in Libya they're attempting to build up momentum to try and do another round of elections in Libya. And of course, for everybody, or for anyone that knows jihadi ideology, elections and democracy are considered a shirk or polytheism, and therefore this has been messaging used by IS against both states to try and recruit people and conduct attacks. We actually saw an attack in Libya against the election headquarters in Tripoli. Though it's kind of surprising that we didn't see anything in Tunisia related to violence for the election earlier this year, though I guess that's a good sign, that there wasn't necessarily the appeal or people able to conduct something along those lines. AQIM has tried to piggyback off of this as well on some level, though even though they're talking about how people shouldn't get involved in elections, a lot of it was more filtered through the context of the French historical presence and legacy of colonialism in the region, which is not necessarily surprising, since the movement has been born out from the Algerian Civil War originally. But what's interesting is that while Libya for so many years was a focus of IS in particular, but also Al-Qaeda as well, there hasn't been that much ideological focus on Libya, even though it was such a large space for jihadism, either by AQIM or by IS. So what that means, it's hard to know, but it does show that there has been a large shift over the last few years in terms of capabilities, interest, and possibility of things expanding instead of retracting, as we're seeing more so now. But as I said, with the case of Libya, it is something that still should be paid attention to, just because we're seeing a doubling in attack pace this year versus last year. So I'll leave it at there. Thank you. I look forward to our talk between us.
Hi everyone, I'm Milo Comerford from the Blair Institute. I'm an analyst who's been focused there on Islamist extremism, looking at Salafi jihadi propaganda in particular over the last 5 years. After these great presentations, I'm going to take a slightly more zoomed out look at theatres of global jihad. We've had some great descriptions of sub-Saharan Africa, of North Africa, and we're going to have a great one on the AFPAC region after this as well. But I'm going to split my time between two things that various research projects I've been working on speak to with this, and they are splitting it between looking at geopolitical theatres, and in particular the overlap between different theatres in global jihad, and intellectual theatres, by which I mean the kind of battles for religious legitimacy that global jihadists are mobilizing. So I'm going to start with a map from a new project that we're releasing. So I've got a few more slides than the previous presenters, but I'll whiz through them pretty quickly. So our Global Extremism Monitor has been analysing open source information on Islamist extremism globally. That's being released next week, but I just want to kind of put this up here as an indication of the various epicenters you have of global jihad, but also to just emphasize its global nature and the number of countries that it's affecting. So this is a monitor that's capturing extremist violence beyond just terrorism, also looking at offensive and counter efforts by states. I'm happy to answer any questions on that afterwards. And while we have a decline in ISIS operations, as we've heard throughout this conference, I think I really just wanted to emphasize that we are seeing a much broader Salafi jihadi challenge that exists as well. We've already heard reference to a lot of Salafi jihadi groups in this panel and previous, but there are a number that share the entire ideological belief system of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and there are some that share a considerable proportion that are responsible for many number of attacks throughout 2017. But what I want to talk about first is about the interplay between theatres of global jihad. This is drawing on a report that I wrote a couple of years ago, which is looking at the profiles of senior figures within the jihadi movement over the past 30 years, looking at 100 of the key figures, analysing their profiles, their backgrounds, the interplay between them, and how these figures have driven global jihadism, particularly since the Afghan conflict. And really just to emphasize that globalization, you know, the vast majority of these prominent figures are using, have been in multiple conflicts, and whilst half of them have the latest theatre of operation before they die or arrested or are still in this theatre. As a foreign country, the majority have been active in multiple conflicts throughout their jihadi careers. We've seen a number of these kind of maps. I think this kind of layers quite neatly over what Jacob was presenting earlier, except perhaps the absence of the Lake Chad region. So when we're looking at global jihadism, I think the lack of the Lake Chad region, he was mentioning that there's new research coming out that's going to plug in the developments there into the broader movement globally, looking at the Horn of Africa, looking at the APAC region. But these are really the kind of key conflicts that are tying together this global jihadi movement in which the majority of these figures have been active in. And you can see that they have a number of shared characteristics that we've heard earlier, loose borders, ungoverned spaces, and the ability to travel between these large contiguous geographic areas. And finally, just to mention the point about the network-driven spread of global jihadism, there's been a lot of focus on destroying ISIS as a brand, on removing its territorial holdings in Iraq and Syria, but just to kind of look backwards at the history of the movement and how this has really been driven by key figures. You can find this full timeline in the report I wrote, Milestones to Militancy, but it really showcases these personalities rather than these groups themselves as the vehicles for the development of global jihadism. And that ties together these various theatres there between the Horn of Africa, the APAC region, and the Sahel and the Levant. So the second thing I wanted to present on, and so far I've done 5 minutes, so on track, is about the battle for religious legitimacy that these global jihadi groups are drawing on. And this is drawn from a piece of research that I did last year, which was using some software from Herzliya's own Interview, who are a natural language processing company who help to classify the ideological content of texts. And essentially what we are doing with this is taking samples of texts and comparing their ideological content, looking at Salafi jihadism next to non-violent extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat Islami, and then comparing that again to a mainstream sample of religious texts to really emphasize the kind of ideological and religious contests that are happening between these different types of documents. Yeah, as mentioned, this kind of used a large sample of texts and was trying to draw out the differences in how they recourse to religious arguments, both in terms of the concepts that are used and in terms of the resources that are used to justify these arguments. I'm thinking particularly here about how Salafi jihadi groups, for instance, use the Quran differently to mainstream texts. So I'll go into some of the key findings there. Again, you can find more on this on the report. You can just Google struggle over scripture, and you can find that there. But the key things here are about the ideological distance, according to our findings, between Salafi jihadism and the concepts it draws on when compared to the mainstream. The proximity between non-violent Islamism and Salafi jihadism, as we'll see in a minute. And the fact also that counter-narrative efforts aimed at targeting these ideologies are failing because they're not actually countering those religious arguments that are being used and mobilized by extremists, both violent and non-violent. So first I want to start with scripture. The analysis that we did here showed that there were kind of considerable distinctions between the use of scripture between mainstream texts, kind of fatwas from authoritative religious institutions and extremists, but a lot of overlap, as you can see, between Islamists and Salafi jihadi stuff. 64% of the top verses that were being mobilized, and this is the top 50 verses across the propaganda, were in common between these two sets of data. The Quran itself is used a lot more in Salafi jihadi propaganda to affirm its message than it is in mainstream text, but it draws on an extremely narrow section of the Quran. It's incredibly cherry-picked, the verses that you're seeing, and are taken from very specific aspects of scripture. And you can see here again, to emphasize that point, the considerable overlap between the Islamist and the Salafi jihadi texts that we studied, just to show when we're looking at theatres of global jihad, there's a lot of kind of tension here between the concepts and the kind of religious interpretations that we're seeing. A similar approach to concepts, this software that we used allowed us to draw out the salient religious concepts that were prevalent in these texts. And looking at the crossover again, you're seeing limited crossover between mainstream and and Salafi jihadi texts, seeing a lot of crossover between the Islamists and Salafi jihadi, but also a lot more, and this is really comes to the title of the panel about theatres of global jihad. When we're talking about the kind of key concepts that are being battled over here within, you know, a religion of 1.6 billion people, you can see that the propaganda of these extremist groups are drawing on these disputed religious concepts much more. You know, the idea of caliphate, the idea of jihad has multiple interpretations, but the sheer fact of it is that these groups are relying on these contested concepts almost exclusively. And just to make that point even clearer, there's a analysis here of the central Islamic concepts of fasting, prayers, and preaching, and how far down they are in Salafi jihadi content. They don't reach there until the 30s. You know, this is dominated by politicized ideals of caliphate, of jihad, and they are largely absent from these texts. I'm going to skip this, it's not particularly relevant for this, but I want to kind of leave some of the implications up on the screen about what I was drawing out from this study. I think it's about understanding the fact there is this tension between within the kind of the House of Islam. There was a book published by Ed Hussein earlier this year that talked about the House of Islam being on fire, but you know there are plenty of people within the House who want to put the fire out, and they're looking for allies to do that. And I think the key thing to do that is to acknowledge the fact this is you know there is tension here, and there are a lot of counter narratives that exist, but that perhaps need to be better refined, that allow us to be on the right side of the argument. So yeah, that's my kind of slightly abstract take on theatres of global jihad, and look forward to your questions on the kind of very broad range of things that I've presented here. Thank you.
Use my presentation. It's okay. The same thing. No, it's okay.
All right. So Milo just set the standard by coming in well under 10 minutes, and I'm going to try and beat even that. Really, I just want to provide a few kind of macro ideas. I think it's a really important time to be thinking about theaters of global jihad. And I love the fact that this panel is taking both a geographic and an ideas-based approach to the idea of theaters of global jihad. At a time when the dawla of the Islamic State is no longer, the so-called caliphate is no longer. It is, as we entitled in a recent Washington Institute study, it is neither remaining nor expanding. I think it's important to think about the ways in which these theaters in which Islamist militancy is presenting itself is changing. And I think that one of those is a recalibration of the traditional idea of the near and the far jihad. And one of the ways we're seeing it is in terms of how regionally focused these militant groups start off, how regionally focused they continue to be, and the types of things that shift that focus. And it can shift back and forth. The Islamic State started very much focused in the region, obviously took a turn for targeting the West. And while the Islamic State as a state no longer exists, the group very much does. Its followers are still being driven to attack. Like-minded followers are still being driven to the ideas. And the expectation is, certainly in the near to medium term, that we will see a continuation of that spectrum of directed, inspired attacks, even beyond those, discounting those perhaps larger attacks organized by the group itself. Think, for example, of the importance today of the Islamic State provinces continuing to carry the torch for the Islamic State at a time when the Islamic State core can't do it anymore. And they're more important at a time when they're getting less funding, still getting media support, but less media support from the core. Think about the importance, for example, of something like the Islamic State nearby here in the Sinai, which right now is primarily targeting Egyptian targets, not Israeli targets, not Western targets, but which is also drawing in not large numbers, but certainly dozens of not really returning, they're not returning to their home countries, but further traveling of foreign terrorist fighters from various parts of the world, in particular Russian-speaking Central Asia, other parts of Africa. And think of what that might do for ISIS and Sinai. Think about the fact that ISIS and Sinai, you might wonder why that's an attractive place for Russian-speaking Central Asian jihadis to go to as their next venue of jihad, until you remember that this is a group that took down a Russian airliner, and that maybe resonates still today in a very significant way with some of those angry and now experienced Russian-speaking jihadis. I think that this idea of the returning foreign terrorist fighter, though it has not presented itself and anywhere near the numbers that many people, especially in Europe, feared it might, is definitely very far from over. The fact that a significant portion of returnees are not returning and are being killed, but that a significant portion of those who are returning, and at least for the time being, for one reason or another, not engaging in militancy. Some are even going home and just trying to re-enter regular life. Now, I feel for, I started my career in FBI counterterrorism. I feel for, law enforcement working in counterterrorism who need to try and figure out how to deal with people like that. For how long is someone like that necessarily going to remain uninvolved? We see people coming in and out of militancy, especially if you look back at the fact that before there was an Islamic State, before there was Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat al-Sham or whatever they're calling themselves today, there were people being drawn as foreign fighters to defend Sunni men, women, and children from the barbarity of the Assad regime, and in a concept not of offensive jihad, but of defensive jihad. And you could have a situation today, tomorrow, next year, next decade, where something else happens and they are re-energized or pushed back into this idea of militancy. I happen to be very, very concerned about the fact that, like it or not, and I certainly don't, Assad has won this war. The battle for Idlib that we're all talking about effectively is over before it started. And the fact that now the man who has killed Bashar al-Assad, exponentially more people than the Islamic State all told, using no less horrific tactics, though it's equally frustrating that in the West we tend to get very, very, very upset and angry about chemical weapons, but our focus on that almost suggests that we're not as upset by the many, many, many more people who are being killed in very, very large numbers by conventional weapons. Those types of ideas, I fear, are going to generate new generations of people who are going to become angry and drawn to militancy in one way or another. And I do think that that kind of homegrown violent extremist phenomenon is going to continue to be a very, very significant challenge to those of us involved in different aspects of countering violent extremism, or what in the United States is now being referred to as terrorism prevention. You may have in some ways less of a pull, because for many the pull was not the Islamic State videos of beheadings, but the Islamic State videos of the building of a state, the positive messages, come get in on the ground level of building the caliphate, just like the original followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. A huge difference between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda is that Al-Qaeda only knows what it's against. And ISIS, ironically maybe, also presented a positive vision, getting there through horrific, horrific methods, but a positive message of what it wanted to achieve. That positive message may no longer be there in the same way, but other pushes and other pulls remain, and I fear that we don't pay anywhere enough attention as we're focused on all of the things going on in the Middle East or in Asia that are wrong, that are driving militancy. We do not pay anywhere near enough attention to the problems, the ills in our own Western societies that are driving homegrown violent extremism at least as much as all these other things. I do think that the issue of terrorist groups that are primarily not controlling significant amounts of territory is a win. It's a completely different type of terrorist problem. And Yossi's right These groups require far less money, and we have some very unique challenges we can discuss in the Q&A if you want on how to track that money, our ability in terms of combating terror finance and following the money. It's a much bigger challenge in many ways now than it used to be, dealing with a largely homegrown violent extremist problem. But when you're dealing with groups that don't have that much money, you're also dealing with smaller groups that are engaged in smaller tactics and cannot carry out the type of spectacular attacks that require more money and more importantly, training and a base from which to battle. I think there's some other things that we need to think about, and I'll just give you one and leave it at that to leave as much time as possible for conversation, and that is, last year we had the Battle of Marawi in the Philippines, where you had an ISIS province, an ISIS affiliate, if you will, come pretty damn close to taking over a city. What was more interesting in some ways was the little-known fact that they were getting various types of support, including financial support, from Islamic State Corps. Islamic State Corps was very excited about this. And it does suggest that that type of operation is less likely to be able to happen the way it almost succeeded in Marawi, as long as we are able to kind of keep the lid on Islamic State Corps in the Middle East. That, by the way, should not be taken as a given. There's plenty of stuff going on involving both Islamic State and other al-Qaeda type of elements in the Middle Euphrates Valley, and arguably much, much more importantly, certainly for the Islamic State, in Iraq. Iraq, I think many people look at as a closed book, and to my mind, Iraq is a huge, huge vulnerability. We're nowhere near where we need to be, neither on the Islamic State side, nor on the Shia extremist side, which is another issue for another discussion. Let me leave it at that and invite Eitan to come up with the slides of his that I have not used. And then we'll go to Stephen, and we'll end with a conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I heard that I have only 10 minutes. My student will tell you the 10 minutes I've just warmed up. So you need to stop me whenever you like, and I try
Thank
to...
you, Eitan.
Thanks. Okay, I'm obeying, you know. Okay, the approach that I took is totally different than the approaches that was taken by the presentation of the group scholar before me. What I try to show, there is somebody that deliver directions and orders and directives to the theaters of jihad. Okay, at the end of the day, there are managers, these are the leadership of these organizations that publish through their speeches policy. The policy is translated into strategy. The strategy is translated on the ground into operation. So that I try to show how it's worked from the level of the Al-Qaeda Central on one hand, ISIS on the other hand, going down to another layer of leadership, going down to the level of the head of the jihadi front, and then to operations on the ground. And all the system from top down working to deliver these messages to the different theaters of jihad. So this is one of the things that I want you to understand from my argument. So it's not by coincidence that I use the first concept of Zawahiri, one ummah, one war, and on multiple fronts. Meaning, we are working together, and this is one of the things that Zawahiri try to promote all the time, unification, unification, unification. We are working together beyond the borders of a state to achieve the goals of a radical Islam. And this is the ideas behind what I'm trying to deliver. On the other side, when you take the strategic and the policy, the major policy component of Al-Qaeda, you can see that Al-Qaeda is taking the lead in the battle for the heart and the mind of the people, regrouping Al-Qaeda in different areas around the world. Some of them was described here on Africa soil, having local agreement, and at the end of the day, talking all the time about unification. This is the main idea behind the operations of Al-Qaeda. The main ideas behind the operations of ISIS is, first of all, their situation today, they need to survive. They are in the middle or the beginning of the process that Al-Qaeda started in 2000. I finished? I need to finish? No, you're great. Okay. I see you looking at your watch. Okay. I see the ideas of within ISIS, they are in the beginning of the process that Al-Qaeda started in 2001, meaning they need to survive. They are going from being hierarchical organization, centralized organization, to be a decentralized organization. So they try to promote all the time the idea that we are here, what Matthew Levitt described, not remaining, not expanding, but they try to promote this idea that we are remaining and we are expanding, building themselves, regrouping again, trying to find local agreement, building these issues from at the beginning. And more important than that, I think they try to rebrand themselves. You know, the caliphate was collapsed. Now we have virtual caliphate. Now we have guerrilla warfare. Now we are doing things in Syria and Iraq and also in Afghanistan and Khorasan. If I need to put in the middle the component between these organizations, there is a tension. One tension I'm saying is competition, because they compete one the other, because they need to control the recruitment capability, the people capability, so they have a major a competition between themselves. But at the same time, we have some discussions regarding unification. We don't know where this unification will happen, because as you know, there are two big egos of Zawahiri and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but in the future, nobody knows if they are unified or not. It's the dangerous scenarios if they are unified and operate together at the same time. So what I try to do based on this argument that I started, I took from the last 2 years the major component insight from the speeches of the high-ranking leadership within Al-Qaeda, trying to see what are the major topics that they deliver within these messages. So you can see here Zawahiri messages, first of all calling for unification between the jihadi groups. Then he had a long session that deal with the Palestinian issues. You know, the Palestinian issue was raised up during the last years, so he dealt with the Palestinian issues, need to deal with Al-Aqsa. There is another component that they said very clearly, as Matthew described it, going back to the far enemy, all the things, United States is the main enemy of Al-Qaeda, and we need to fight this far enemy. But on the other side, because Zawahiri is not just operating as Al-Qaeda, a global dealing with the global issues, he is also connecting to the jihadi front, so you can find out here information regarding attacking France and calling the Mujahideen on Africa soil to carry out an attack, and also issues that connected to Egyptian regime. On the other side, when you are going down to the second level of operation within these speeches, going to Hamza bin Laden that established himself since 2015 until today as one of the leaders, the future leaders of Al-Qaeda, he is talking about the same issues. He's talking about carried out an attack against the West. He's talking about condemning the Saudi regime. He's talking about calling the jihad. You can see that the main issues of the policy, you can find it in every level of operation. So if we go down to another level of operation, the front organization, and you're trying to analyze the information that was within the speeches of Akim Commander, Drugdal, he's talking about the same things with more focus on the regional arena. But it's the same component, the same concept within the policy of the organization. And then within this publication of Drugdal, you can start to find out also a combination of lone wolves, meaning we are going even down to the level of the operation, and we need to have and to prepare people for these kind of operation. But it's not only in the areas of Drugdal, meaning Akim. You can find the same ideas, the same component, even within Al-Shabaab group, that are not operating, isolating themselves from other groups within Al-Qaeda, intensify the attack against the enemies, advises Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to carry out more attack, promoting the Syrian jihad as open to foreign fighters, meaning what we can see again and again is this kind of component. If you understand my ideas until now, even in Kashmir we have the same issue, but I don't have enough time, so I continue my presentation. So if I take all these pictures, all these issues, and trying to put them on one place, policy of Al-Qaeda, the battle for heart and mind, unification, strategy, the 7 phases strategy, all the strategies that Al-Qaeda published during the years, and the vision is in the middle. At the end of the day, establishing the caliphate, but the way that Al-Qaeda tried to establishing the caliphate is through emirate, meaning taking control over small areas, and then when the time will come, we will do it and establish the caliphate, and they talk again and again and bringing it again and again the story of the far enemy and the near enemy and how we need to proceed. So these are information. At the end of the day, when you are dealing with Al-Qaeda materials, you can find out how they translate the policy into strategy. And there is here a very unique, a very interesting publication that was published by Saif Adel, one of Al-Qaeda members, founders of Al-Qaeda, that he discussed the jihad and the wind of change, revolution and strategy. And what you see within his kind of discussions, first of all, the importance to recruiting public support. This is what we see within Al-Qaeda during the last years, important to recruit the public support. And beside these recruiting public support, trying to build capabilities to carry out an operation, because as you know, Al-Qaeda is a decentralized organization operating a different modus operandi around the world. So if I take this information that was published by the Saif al-Adel, and you see how it was translated on the ground, you can find out very clearly that in Yemen, they established a jihadi military academy headed by this guy, Al-Anasi, that what he delivered within his trainings, 3 levels of lectures. Lectures for beginners, lectures for advanced students, and lectures for experts, that they are dealing how to carry out an operation in every level. Strategic level, ground strategy, indirect strategy, technology, importance of maneuvers, operational level, offense, defense, tactic level, how to operate. Thank you very much that you closed my session.
Okay. You see, you are a tough leader.
I know, for the record, I gave him another minute. But okay.
Yeah.
How do I move your slides? Just this here? Oh, great. Okay, thank you very much. 2 would be great, thanks. Thank you very much for having me here today. This is my first time attending this conference, and I've enjoyed it very much so far, and I'm honored to be here. We're going to end the panel presentation portion today with talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, which was the first theater of global jihad, arguably, but today it's primarily a regional theater. Fears that Afghanistan and Pakistan could become a main hub for global jihad once again are resonant, especially because of the introduction of the Islamic State of Khorasan province into the region, the potential for Al-Qaeda's return. I'd argue that right now we have entered a period of managed violence in both countries that is keeping terrorism contained to the region more or less. And I'll start with Pakistan because it is both a victim of terrorism and a supporter of the Taliban-led insurgency in Afghanistan.
only going to inflict 3 slides on you today. Let me begin with Pakistan by saying that the Pakistan military, which is the arbiter of security policy in the country, is as entrenched as ever, and its segmented approach to terrorist groups is still in place. The slide that you have here depicts 4 distinct types of relationships based on the security establishment's perception of a group's threat to Pakistan and its usefulness for Pakistan. In the upper left-hand quadrant is a relationship defined by belligerents. These are groups that pose a high threat to Pakistan and are not particularly useful to the military and the ISI. In the lower left-hand quadrant, are groups that Pakistan is more or less indifferent towards, not particularly useful, not a major threat, and there is something of a live and let live approach towards these organizations. The bottom right corner are groups that receive state support. Think Taliban, Haqqani Network, Lashkar-e-Taiba. I'll go to a slide in just a moment that populates these 4 quadrants. And then in the top right quadrant are groups that pose both a threat to Pakistan but are also useful for it. We could define this as cooperative competition, or as my students insist that I call them, frenemies. This just briefly gives an overlay of some of these different organizations. And I'll just leave this slide up there. I'm not going to speak to all of these groups. And I should also note, these are not all of the terrorist groups active in Pakistan. Listing all of the groups that are active there would take me well beyond my 10 minutes today. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan remains the most potent threat to the Pakistani state. The recent death of the TTP's leader, Mullah Fazlullah, may actually turn out to be a blessing for the TTP. His ascension to head the organization was contentious because he is not from the Masood tribe. Nur Wali Masood, who has replaced him, is, as his name would suggest, from the Masood tribe. He is close to the Haqqani Network, which is supported by the Pakistani state, and he has a pedigree as both a scholar and as the deputy of Baitullah Masood, who was the man who first led the TTP when it was formed in 2007. Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, or AQIS, which was created in 2014, has adopted a new strategy that I think is worth noting. It has shifted from trying to launch attacks in Pakistan to more quietly working behind the scenes to support other militant allies in the country. The Islamic State for Khorasan province presents an ongoing potential challenge to Pakistan, but it still has not broken out in the ways that some feared it would, given the history of sectarian tension in the country. One issue to watch is ISKP's creation of cyber cells for recruitment purposes in Pakistan. The third point that I just want to note about Pakistan is that although Pakistan is winning its war on terror, religious extremism appears to be growing in society. There's been an increase in religious violence related to blasphemy laws perpetrated by individuals disconnected from militant organizations. But to go back to this point about Pakistan winning its war on terror, terrorist attacks have continued to decline, as they have since 2010, with the exception of a slight uptick in 2013. The overall decrease in the number of terrorist attacks in Pakistan in 2017 was about 16% over the previous year. That's not as significant as it has been in the past years. And so I think we're seeing some diminishing returns in terms of Pakistan's counterterrorism efforts. And we're heading towards a level of steady state violence that is arguably manageable for the Pakistan military and ISI. Let me now turn to Afghanistan. The map you see here shows a breakdown of Taliban and government control in the country. Approximately 146 districts are under government control, 50 under Taliban control, 200 are contested, and 2 are unclear. Let me put this in context for you. Even in areas where the government is theoretically in control, governance is still lacking, which means that the Taliban has the potential for further infiltration into those areas as well. Even if it can't take over, we could see those areas of contestation rise. Now, there's a lot of focus on the Islamic State in Khorasan province in Afghanistan, but the Taliban remains the strong horse in the insurgency there. It has showed that there's an appetite for an end to the conflict in terms of its participation in the ceasefire, But I think more importantly, what the Eid ceasefire showed in June was that the Taliban leadership is able to exert control over the movement. Moreover, even though there may be a desire to bring the conflict to an end at some point, the Taliban is still playing to win on the battlefield, and so are its supporters in the Pakistan military. Both would like to see the conflict resolved, and factions within them are open to negotiations. But the idea in some circles in the US government and military that the Taliban can be beaten into submission and made to capitulate, or that the Pakistan military can be pressured to ending its support for the Taliban-led insurgency is farcical. The US has belatedly moved toward embracing direct talks with the Taliban rather than insisting that these talks be Afghan-led. However, neither the Taliban nor the US government has a uniform position on negotiations or on what an acceptable outcome would look like. Now, when I was last in Kabul last year, there was talk that some of the Taliban might be open to accepting a small US force presence. I've since heard that from numerous other quarters as well. But we're far away from being able to test the proposition that this would be an acceptable outcome to the Taliban. And so at present, we're left with sustaining a pro-US government in Kabul because this is considered necessary for the US to maintain important elements of its security architecture in the country and to conduct counterterrorism operations there. And this brings us to the Islamic State Khorasan province in Afghanistan, which has been heavily targeted by these counterterrorism operations. Abu Saeed Bajar, who was killed earlier this summer, is the third ISKP leader killed by coalition forces in the past 2 years. Despite these losses, the group has been able to regenerate leaders and to absorb fighters from other groups. It has also recently absorbed fighters from the Islamic State's core network in Iraq and Syria. We have foreign fighters who are nationals of Algeria, France, the Russian Federation, Tunisia, Central Asian states, and others migrating to Afghanistan. Thus, ISKP, which began primarily as an organization built off the back of disaffected Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistan members, is today a multinational group. It's been tied to at least one attempted attack in the United States. And it has complex relations with the Taliban and the Haqqani network. It is first and foremost a competitor with these organizations. But we've also seen collaboration with the Taliban in certain areas where members of ISKP and the Taliban come from the same tribes. And there is at least strong speculation, although it's hard to find hard evidence, that the Haqqani network has subcontracted out attacks in Kabul to the Islamic State Khorasan province. These Kabul attacks not only help ISKP to burnish its reputation, but are especially destabilizing because it sends a message to the rest of the country that if Kabul can't even protect itself, protect the capital, then how is it going to provide security for the provinces? This leads me to at least two conundrums with which I'll conclude. The first is a conundrum for the United States regarding whether to focus more on the Taliban or on targeting ISKP. This is a conundrum that is not new. When I was at the Department of Defense, we wrestled with similar questions about where to allocate resources in terms of focusing and counterterrorism efforts on Al-Qaeda or to combating the Taliban. CT strikes against Al-Qaeda then, and arguably AQIS and especially ISKP now are considered necessary to combat a potential immediate threat from emerging. But of course, if the Taliban takes control of the country, then the United States loses its counterterrorism platform. The second conundrum is how the United States and NATO forces move beyond simply propping up the Afghan government, given its poor governance, and Pakistan's ongoing support for and how to also move beyond the current state with Pakistan, where nothing the United States has tried has been able to shift the Pakistani calculus with regards to support for the Taliban. And so that leaves us with where I started, which is the US and some international forces managing violence in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future, because the costs of staying are now lower than the costs of leaving, both politically and strategically. Thank you very much.
All right, so we have plenty of time for questions and answers and conversation, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one quick question. Steve, we'll just start with you, and we'll come on down this way. You know, we've had a series of excellent presentations on different aspects of the theater of global jihad and its changing nature. Aaron and I work at a policy-focused think tank, so I can't help myself. Unless it gets pushed off again, which it very may well, the new U.S. counterterrorism strategy should be released by the White House as early as this month, maybe next week. So if you had the ear of the National Security Advisor, given everything you've heard, whether commenting on your own points that you made or those of your colleagues, what might be one or two things that you would really want to see reflected in the new U.S. counterterrorism strategy, given everything that we've heard in these presentations?
Sure.
So if we can start with you, and you can stay where you are.
Focus specifically on AFPAC or more.
I'm leaving that up to you. If you want to, and for all the speakers, if you want to answer the question based on your particular comments, great. Or if you want to choose to answer something more broadly or another person's comments, that's fine too.
Sure. So I'm going to split the difference and make one point about Afghanistan, Pakistan in particular, and one point more broadly. The point that I would make on Afghanistan and Pakistan is that there has been an ongoing debate within the United States government over how to engage or whether to engage with negotiations with the Taliban. Under the Obama administration, there was this desire to treat the Taliban as a unified entity, not to try to play factions against one another in pursuit of a grand bargain. When the Trump administration came into power, it believed, I don't necessarily think correctly, that the Taliban had to be beaten down before it would be willing to engage in negotiations, and more to the point that it could be beaten down and that the Pakistani state could be pressured to reduce its support for the Taliban. Neither of these assumptions has proven correct. We're beginning to see, I think, a shift in terms of policy where there is a willingness to not only talk to the Taliban, but to talk to factions within the Taliban rather than necessarily trying to treat the whole movement as a unified entity and to wait until there is unity within the movement with regard to whether to pursue negotiations. My advice would be move much more quickly on that front. Yes, we can stay for the foreseeable future. The costs in terms of manpower and resources are not so high that the United States can't continue what it's doing for the next however many years. But that is not, that is, there's always the potential that a tweet ends it all and we're coming home next week, or that U.S. Congress gets tired, or that events in the region overtake us. Negotiations take a really long time, so I would say to the National Security Advisor what I have said to members of his staff, which is move with much more speed to try to put together, and put in place the steps necessary to move forward on negotiations. On counterterrorism strategy more strongly, I would make a strong bid here for an argument that I make in my most recent book, which is on U.S. counterterrorism cooperation with partner nations, which is that the United States historically and understandably views counterterrorism cooperation through a threat-based paradigm. We tend to look at what the threat is in a specific country or region, try to understand that threat, decide what it is we think that we need or want in terms of countering that threat, and then go to our partners and say, give us this. And we tend to overestimate our leverage with regard to our partner nations and to overestimate the capacity that we're going to be able to build in short order to enable them to do the things that we want them to do. We spend very little time thinking about our partners' security paradigm, their threat perceptions, how they view the region, and spend very little time asking ourselves honestly what we could accept
from our partners. And so therefore, we're unable to optimize the cooperation that they are willing to provide, and we're unable to put in place the mitigation steps necessary when they don't provide the cooperation that we so desperately believe that we need in order to accomplish our counterterrorism objectives. So I would say to the National Security Advisor that do not jettison that threat-based paradigm, but augment it with a partner-based paradigm, which would include directing different parts of the interagency to do deep dives into what we can expect from our partners at the outset in terms of the type of counterterrorism cooperation that we're going to need before we go to them, so that we could go with more realistic asks, and so we can use the instruments of statecraft we have more effectively. We can use positive conditionality where we agree in advance on how security assistance is going to be used, things of that nature. So that would be sort of a broader recommendation that I would have.
I'm not, an expert on United States strategy, but I ask myself always the same question. What United States achieved until now in Afghanistan, and this is something that needs to be discussed within United States administration. And the second component is what United States think that they will achieve if they will stay in Afghanistan in the coming years. Because at the end of the day, from outside, you cannot change dramatically the natures of the people inside. So the main question is staying or going out. And the main problem is when you decide to go out, in what terms, in what condition to go out. It's very easy to enter, it's very difficult to go out. So it's something that even beyond what is our interest in the coming months or in the coming years, what is our long-term interest, and decide, here it is the line, and within this line, we are out.
So what I'd probably say is to draw on a point I made in the presentation around the kind of future of the strategy to counter Salafi jihadi ideology, particularly in the Iraq-Syria region, beyond just ISIS. You know, we've had a kind of counter-ISIL coalition that's been formed. The strategy has been very much based on degrading the operations of this specific group. But I was struck yesterday by a presentation from Craig Whiteside, where he was talking about the different manifestations that this group has taken on over the last 10 years. And I think that we need to mobilize those learnings and learn particularly from the Sahwa and the interactions that we've had by not completely jettisoning those lessons. I think that we need to understand that building a more long-term strategy that is based on promoting more effective governance on the ground in these regions and not resting on our laurels. There's a lot of rhetoric of mission accomplished. There's a lot of rhetoric of the final defeat of ISIS as a territorial entity. But I think that the brand and the power of the ideas that this group has tapped into are still threats that we need to be considering.
I think when you look at CT tactics and operations, the U.S. and its allies know what they're doing. They know how to degrade a group. They know how to take a group out of territory. We've seen it time and again. The issue is the strategic aspect and longer-term horizon. And this gets into less specific CT, but more CT adjacent, the whole CVE issues, which I know might not have much of an ear in the Trump administration right now. But it's still important to reinforce and point out, and in relation to Tunisia, but it's also relevant to Iraq, Yemen, France, and other places, is the issue of rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals in prison systems. We've seen time and again that prison systems have become centers of incubation and planning for the future when individuals are out or when there have been prison breaks, whether in the countries I mentioned before. So I think that that's one area that needs a lot of focus because, once people are in prison, that gets them off the battlefield or gets them not being allowed to do the dawah and outreach. But then if you could blunt that even more so in the future and stop individuals from getting involved once again or relapsing or providing an environment where they can recruit other individuals who are in prison for non-jihadi related crimes, that would really strengthen the overall long-term goal of trying to degrade these individuals and groups that lasts instead of just sort of a repeated cycle we see every single time over and over and over again.
So when it comes to counterterrorism, you know, I don't think there's maybe that much difference between counterterrorism and counter-jihadism, because when we talk about, you know, countering terrorism globally, I mean, generally they're not talking about countering the Basques or the Provisional IRA or, you know, Al-Sharikia, whatever's left of that in Japan. And so if you want to counter jihadism, based on my presentation, I think there's two recommendations. What I liked about your research is you do a pretty good job separating Islamism from Salafi jihadism and sort of explaining how they're similar but slightly different. So if I look at AQAM and when they talk about how their movement began in, you know, Algeria in 1993 when the government canceled elections, they still talk about how, you know, in the 80s the platform for their future jihad was set because they had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and its factions coming in, and they had the Tablighi Jamaat coming in, so that this society was prepared for their call to Sharia, which is what AQAM's messaging is. And so I think, you know, Islamism laid a very strong groundwork for what AQAM has done today. So if you want to counter AQAM, the sea, you know, the ocean that they swim in is Islamism. And I see the same case with Boko Haram. I mean, there was a lot of preparation since the 1980s and 1990s with Islamism and talking about how that was incompatible with democracy. And so the groundwork ideologically was framed for the group for a very long time before Boko Haram began waging its jihad. Now, there are countries in the world that that ban Islamism, and that's Central Asia. They have very little terrorism. They had terrorist groups. They don't have them anymore. The problem with banning Islamism is that it restricts freedom of religion. For example, you're not free in your mosque to have Muslim Brotherhood books by, you know, Hassan al-Banna. You're not free to have Tablighi Jamaat literature and stuff like that. So it's in a way a restriction on religion, but in some cases it has led to less terrorism. So I mean, there's has to be some balance there. And I should say, you know, restricting Islamism actually does not necessarily mean restricting Islam. There's lots of practitioners of Islam in a very healthy way in places like Uzbekistan, where they don't have Islamism. But I mean, that's a very difficult policy debate, and there's no doubt that it leads to issues with you know, global conventions on religion. But that's the issue on Islamism. And then finally, in the African context, as I was just mentioning, borders is a very important issue, and a lot of the places in Africa that end up collapsing are because of border spillover. Libya to Mali, currently Mali to Burkina Faso and Niger. You know, Kenya is also sort of a spillover from Somalia. Nigeria pushing into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And it's sort of like the spillover, you know, continues until a state might collapse. And once a state collapses, you're stuck with the Humpty Dumpty problem, where it's incredibly hard to put a place like Mali back together again. So I would say, you know, what can we do to prevent spillover in the sub-Saharan African sub-Saharan African context by preventing border spillover?
So I would like to answer from my perspective, which is economic perspective. You all probably know that the economic situation in the Middle East is changing. Some would say in a negative way. I would say in a positive way. There are less subsidies right now in most Arab states, mainly in the Gulf. There are less revenues from the oil. There are sanctions. Turkey is in problem. All the Middle East is in quite a big challenge when it comes to the economic situation. So I believe that the counter-terrorism we can fight terrorism by economy, by reducing the revenues, by putting pressures on organizations, by putting pressures on banks that wire terror money, by cutting the revenues of organizations like Hezbollah, which establish a quite good business all over the world. So I believe that terrorism, in my opinion, starts with economy. So if you give more opportunities, more education opportunities, if you will give more money to the government, help to establish more business, that will be, for the long term, the best solution how to solve these challenges.
And I'll just add, based on what Yossi just said, and building on some comments Jacob made in his first presentation on the issue of the project horizons that we needing to be longer term, and Aaron's comments on CVE, I really do think that there's a real need to be able to think about CVE in a much longer term fashion. That's difficult for anybody. It's especially difficult in the U.S. political system with what is really much less than a 4-year political cycle. And it's incredibly difficult right now, and this gets to a larger point about CT more broadly, because the signaling has been very, very clear that there are going to be some very, very significant budget cuts across the board, both for the military more broadly, and in particular, apparently, for AFRICOM, and CT in general. There have been lots and lots of discussions already, and the general theme, as much of internal conflict as it is how to do more with less. So there's no question people are going to be asked to do it as what they're doing and more, but there's also no question they're going to be asked to do it with a lot less money, which means our ability to do kind of strategic CVE, not just the no less important, but rehabilitation, but really kind of the PVE, the preventive, is going to be very, very difficult, and I think that really needs to get some serious thought in this next strategy. The second thing is, I think that we need to recognize the significance in terms of the ideological problems of sectarianism, which is different than religion and is somewhat different than the jihadi, Salafi Venn diagram. There is connective tissue, even though this panel is not about Shia extremism, between the need to be able to have a holistic strategy that deals with the various variations of the terrorist and jihadi threat, Sunni and Shia both, but there's connections to all of this. Sunnis around the world increasingly believe that the West, and in particular the United States, I travel throughout the region a lot, I hear this all the time, they are convinced that the United States just doesn't care about Sunnis. And we swore we weren't going to get involved in the war on ISIS and under the Obama administration, and we didn't until a small number of Western journalists were beheaded. And without minimizing those tragedies, at a minimum, tens, probably hundreds of thousands of people had already been killed and displaced at that point, but they were only Sunni Muslims, and so the world didn't really care. And then to their perception, we bent over backwards on the JCPOA, and whether you agree with that or not, whether I agree with that or not is immaterial. There is a real perception out there that the West doesn't really care very much about Sunnis. And we therefore need to be able to have a holistic strategy that deals with the full range of these problems and the sectarian nature of the ideology and the radicalization process that's driving both. Right? Many Sunnis believe that radical Shia are out to destroy them, and so they need to target the other before they get hurt, and vice versa. And that's a different type of ideological component that we haven't had as much of a need to deal with in the past. I just want to echo something I said earlier about the Assad regime. There's nothing we can do, I believe, at this point about the Assad regime staying. So we really need to think very hard about what we do next, because the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad himself, remaining in power, I believe, is going to be a massive, significant driver of extremism and a magnet for radicalization. The final thing is, I think this is a very opportune moment. It's a great opportunity to start putting meat on the bones, which no one has done in any public way, about what is going to be the future. And I'm even talking in the immediate, let alone the medium term, of the counter-ISIL coalition. You can't, on the one hand, say basically ISIL's been defeated, and on the other hand, say you're going to keep the coalition, but to what end? Much of what the U.S. and the coalition is doing in Syria isn't actually about ISIL at this point. At Tanf, it's about something else. and the coalition isn't really as active as it once was in Iraq, where I believe we need to be much more engaged. So is there a way to reconfigure, reshape the counter-ISIL coalition? You know, to my mind, it's kind of like Al-Qaeda in the early years, the debate between bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam. You know, what's next? Abdullah Azzam wanted to target Israel. Bin Laden wanted to go more globally. You had this international network that they built. How is it going to be leveraged next? Because the one thing they agreed on is they didn't want to give up on this network. We've built this international coalition. The one thing I think everybody agrees on is we don't want to give up this coalition. This coalition has done some great work, but we're at that precipice where we need to decide how are we going to try and use it next. I'd like now, we have about an hour, which is great, to open this up to the experts on this side of the room. Raise your hand. I will repeat the question for the recording so that your question is recorded for posterity. If your question is directed at a particular scholar, please say so. If not, if it's for anybody, please say so. And we have time to get to a whole lot of people. So I saw you first. We'll go here, and we'll get to everybody. So please.
My question is about the issue of mass migration from Africa and the Middle East. And the question is basically, do you believe that mass immigration in some part is a strategy by organized terrorist groups? And if the answer is yes, what kind of actions do you believe are possible to be taken to counter this strategy not in Europe, but on the soil of African countries and countries in the Middle East?
So the question is, does anyone believe that mass immigration from Africa and the Middle East is at some level an organized policy? And is there a way to deal with that not only on the European side, but more preemptively in Africa and the Middle East? Anybody maybe want to start with that, Stephen?
So I'll jump in on that only because I was in Copenhagen a couple days ago at a conference where they are looking at putting forces on the ground in the Sahel in large part because of concerns about migration. And one of the assumptions on which they are working is that violent extremist organizations that are present in the region may not be strategically trying to drive migration, that I don't know, but that they are involved in the smuggling, not the trafficking, but the smuggling of persons, which is that they have moved in on and taken over some of those smuggling routes, and so that you have terrorist organizations that are involved with moving illegal migrants to Europe. And so that by knocking those organizations off balance, you could potentially reduce the flow of people coming into Europe. Now, I think that you have to balance that against the potential that by further militarizing the response in the Sahel, you can also drive migration more into Europe. And then that must be balanced against the need to provide security. So, I think there's a lot of struggling and fumbling about for how to solve the migration problem going on in European capitals today. I will say that having spent several weeks earlier this year looking at European counterterrorism cooperation out of area in the Middle East and Africa, that at least in almost all of the European capitals that I was in, terrorism is very much seen within the context of a larger fragile states problem, in which migration is arguably a bigger issue. And so while there is concern in some capitals about external operations, right, particularly Paris, a bit in Brussels, in the UK, the bigger issue is how do we achieve security in these regions because we need to stem the flow of people coming from them to our shores.
So since it touches on the Sahel or Africa, it's important to note that a lot of the migrants coming into Europe are coming from Senegal, Guinea. The ones coming from Nigeria are mostly not coming from where Boko Haram operates. They're often coming from, say, the south of the country. Others are coming from Eritrea, not necessarily from Mogadishu. So a lot of the migrants are coming from places that actually are not facing big terrorism threats. So there's other factors involved that are causing them to travel to Europe. I think once they get to Europe is where you might see Islamist and jihadist groups trying to take advantage of them after they're already there. Islamists for recruiting recruiting more members, making them more conservative. Because a lot of them come from parts of Africa that are Muslim, but they're not conservative in the way Islamists are. And then of course ISIS has tried to recruit migrants in order to carry out attacks. And yeah, as Stephen said, he's probably right, because AQIM and these groups are so tied into the trafficking and smuggling networks of the Sahel, it's hard to imagine that they would be completely divorced from the migrants moving up in terms of profiting off them in some way. But that's more of an AQIM network thing and not necessarily something related to Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram if we look at those two groups.
Great, so I want to come back to the slide I had up about the kind of hubs, the regional hubs of jihadism that have spawned and fanned the flames of a global movement. And I think what's very telling about all of those 4 places, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, looking at the Syria-Iraq theater, and AFPAC, is this perpetual theme of huge numbers of refugees and huge number of people being driven from their homes. And you've got a kind of chicken and egg element to this fragility aspect that's been discussed. Jihadis seize on elements of spaces that aren't being governed, and they pop up and thrive in those contexts as well. So it is just a fact of these kind of insurgencies that we're talking about, that there are huge numbers of displaced people that are very vulnerable, but vulnerable to all kinds of things, economic, food security. There has been some limited research about the potential radicalization of these communities, but in Europe in particular, we're seeing a hugely polarized conversation around the inherent challenge of Muslim majority refugees that has really kind of divided policy communities and has led to a lot of attacks on very vulnerable communities there. What I'll say as well is that in the context of the Sahel, this seems to be increasingly seen through the lens of a kind of European neighborhood issue. So that's one of the big drivers of Macron's engagement with the region, has been about solving these conflicts at root in order to avoid the issues that come down the line with these kind of waves of migration and so on. So I think that the kind of security aspect in solving the fragile states issue is being seen very much in terms of domestic policy as well in a lot of European capitals.
Only add to that to say I've spent some time recently over the past year and a half with NATO on these issues. NATO created NATO South as a hub. There's several things that led to that, including President Trump's insistence that NATO had to, in his perception, finally deal with terrorism. I'd argue they were doing that for a long time, or else maybe funding might be cut, and that led NATO to try and think about how they could, come up with something that would satisfy that. But there was also a real need among the southern states in Europe, a real desire to see something that would address their immediate concerns, as opposed to kind of NATO East that was dealing with Ukraine and Russia, etc. And for them, this was seen as a CT problem, though they were quite open about the fact that they did not see this, at least not yet, as an organized top-down strategy pushed by terrorist groups to destabilize Europe. Would terrorist groups like this, seeing it as a way? Sure, but that this was primarily being driven by other factors that you've already heard about. We had a question over here, I think.
Yes. Mr. Zenn, you mentioned a few days ago the West wouldn't want to put boots on the ground in West Africa. I was wondering, how will the recent military pledge from the UK to Nigeria affect on-the-ground dynamics? And also, how does the specter of Boko Haram and the ISIS element in the Sahel, how does that affect regional issues and international issues?
So there seems to be 2 parts of that question. The first part is related to...
We are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Listen, we're repeating the question.
Yeah. So there were 2 parts of the question. The first part related to the recent UK, Nigeria discussions about countering terrorism and UK living up to its commitments. And that related more broadly to what I talked about 2 days ago on a panel, which was the West, including the US, not having a desire to put boots on the ground in Africa, like we've seen in Iraq and the Middle East and Afghanistan and South Asia. And then the second part of the question was, how does the fact that Boko Haram is an ISIS province and that ISIS has other affiliates in Africa affect the issue number 1 that I mentioned? So, okay. So to take it together, I think, yeah, I don't expect the UK to actually, put boots on the ground, or the United States to really put boots on the ground. But that's why the US is setting up some type of drone base in Niger, which is apparently going to be very large. It seems like the US support to counter Boko Haram in Cameroon is also more, intelligence gathering and training, although that's been reduced because of reports of Cameroonian human rights abuses. So whatever support the UK gives to Nigeria, I still don't expect anything in terms of UK boots on the ground, but it might be in terms of training to counter IEDs, intelligence training, surveillance training, how to protect your barracks, because Boko Haram's ISIS affiliate has knocked down about 4 or 5 military barracks in the past weeks, which is raising a very high level risk in that region right now. So I still think it's going to be capacity building in anything they do, or technology. And it's actually going to really be up to the Nigerians to solve the issue. And so that's what I expect to that. As for the fact that ISIS does have provinces in Africa and affiliates, perhaps I'll leave that to one of my colleagues just to share the mic. But I think it leads to one of the things that Matt had discussed, which was, what does the counter-ISIS coalition do now that ISIS is defeated in a territorial sense in Iraq and Syria? Can the counter-ISIL coalition now be used to counter the ISIS provinces, and is that desirable? Or is actually trying to attack all the ISIS provinces going to actually help them, because they're going to be resilient to that and rise as a result of pressure? I'll leave that to my colleagues.
Anybody else? We're good? All right, we had a question over here. You still, all right? See.
Okay, thanks. I'm again from ICT. A lot of what each of you has spoken about are sort of pieces in a puzzle about early warning and forecasting, governance breakdown, the outbreak of political violence, etc. And over the last decade in particular, we've had literature's made big gains in terms of trying to develop models of forecasting political instability and and major sort of governance breakdowns. I wonder if one or two or more people on the panel would want to talk a little bit about this methodology, right? In a world of very finite resources, if I have $1 billion to invest in the next couple of years, do I invest it in preventing Mali from collapsing? Do I focus on Niger? Do I focus on Egypt? Do I focus on Jordan? How do we think about this methodology of early warning and forecasting that is tailor-made for trying to understand the future diffusion and spread of theaters of global jihad?
So in a nutshell, is there a way to apply methodologies for early warning and forecasting to help us answer the very difficult question of how and where to spend our limited dollars and euros and shekels to counter or preemptively prevent terrorist problems? And I can tell you from the U.S. Government's perspective, I participated in some of these conversations. It's even more complicated than that. Do you necessarily want to try and do as much prevention as possible? Do you have the luxury? Maybe there's too much going on in the immediate, and I got to put my dollars there, and I don't have the luxury of applying to prevention. Or maybe the methodology is something completely different. Maybe the methodology is, because I have limited funds, where can I get the biggest bang for my buck? So there might be a bigger problem over here, but with my limited money, I could actually solve this somewhat smaller problem better. And so how do you figure out where to spend your money? Anybody? That's answer enough right there, isn't it?
Well, I would imagine, I mean, I haven't looked into this specifically, but it would make sense that it would be a lot cheaper to do preventative work than to spend money after things have already started to crack, because then the money just goes down a black hole, as we've seen. So preventative for sure.
So I'll just jump in to say right away, so I don't disagree, but as soon as you get into preventative, how do you quantify and qualify that in terms of its CT piece? In other words, is that development money? Is poverty program, is that necessarily a CT thing? Should it come from a CT budget? The more preventative you get, the less clear the connective tissue to actual terrorism issues, which further complicates budgets and gets into the issue Jacob raised earlier again about finding reliable funding streams over time, looking into the future. By the way, also not just looking at what is the current, but what might be tomorrow's threats as I'm looking at putting a program in place for 4, 5, 6 years looking ahead.
Can I, so not to be even more pessimistic, but let me say as a former policymaker, I think you're giving policymakers far too much credit. That simply because these methodologies exist, that policymakers are going to be able to digest that information and to act on it when there is not a crisis. I mean, yes, it is absolutely logical that you want to intervene early to avoid a crisis, and at the same time, getting that influx of money, leaving aside whether or not you can actually show value for it after the case in terms of assessment, monitoring, and evaluation, but getting a country to pour resources in, based on the potential for a crisis to develop is going to be a very, very tough sell. I think it also, we tend to focus a lot on resources in terms of money and manpower, and I would argue that the most important resource from a policymaker's perspective is time and attention. And getting senior level policymakers to break away from the however many crises they are dealing with on any day, to focus the type of time and attention that you would need to intervene is very, very difficult. And the final point that I would make, and I think this does go back to the larger CVE specific versus CVE relevant debate that has been going on, at least in the United States. Right, CVE specific are those smaller, more micro interventions, but they don't touch on large things like rule of law, governance, socioeconomic development, what have you. And the argument is essentially, well, the CVE relevant stuff is impossible to accomplish, so we have to focus on the CVE specific stuff. The CVE specific stuff is necessary, but not sufficient, so we have to focus on the CVE, the bigger things. And we just end up going round and around and around. But the bottom line at the end of the day is when you're talking about, those things that you would have to intervene on to prevent a crisis, a lot of these issues are simply intractable. That an external actor could come in and intervene in the ways necessary to address governance problems, rule of law problems, socioeconomic development problems. These are political problems where people within the country have huge invested interests. That's just it's a really, really tough lift. So I think, I'm familiar with some of the methodologies. I think they've gotten a lot better. I think we'll get a lot better at predicting those crises potentially coming down the pike, and we still won't necessarily be able to do much with that information. Sorry.
Milo and Eitan?
Yeah, I think all the points here are very relevant, and I just wanted to come in focusing particularly on Stephen's point about monitoring and measurement of this kind of stuff, because it is, by definition, proving a negative. If you've invested a huge amount of money and nothing happens, that's not necessarily going to make a policymaker kind of feel like excited about the efficacy of that intervention. But I think that perhaps it requires thinking about this in a slightly different way. So rather than thinking purely about the counter-terrorism effects of an intervention, rather thinking about how we measure aspects of resilience. So we were hearing about some of these measures here around rule of law, around socioeconomics, and around CVE relevant rather than CVE specific interventions. And I think that as a policy community, it's essential that we kind of come up with more creative ways of measuring this. So rather than just trying to prove the negative of having stemmed a potential issue down the line. So how are we measuring, working with communities, what resilience looks like, and how our interventions have helped to bolster those kind of measures.
As you know, Amichai, one of the things that we need to deal when it comes to finding way to lower the motivation, because at the end of the day, first of all, motivation is not only military capability, it's something that is not only on the eyes or the operation that need to carry it out by United States. This is something that should be an international effort. and when you deal with the international effort, how the international community enter into these places with a long-term a program, because at the end of the day, if you spend millions of dollars from one component, you will never be able to have any success, and you need to build a program that you can measure it and build it for 5 to 10 years, because the result, you will not find it in the first year or in the second year. You will start to find the result only when you are dealing with these components a lot of time. And you need to be able to cooperate with the local authorities, not operating from outside without the local authorities. You need also to recruit the local authorities to operate within this field.
Okay, I want to make sure I get the full room here, not just people in the front. All right. Okay, right here then.
This is mostly for Jacob Zenn, who mentioned that fighting Islamism is as important as anything else we're doing. Aside from targeting specific texts that you mentioned, as other countries have done, what policies do you think can best help combat Islamism?
So this is again a challenging question, because there's a battle between how much space do you give for freedom of religion and how much space do you give for combating Islamism. And I think it's contradictory. Like, you cannot combat Islamism without impinging on freedom of religion. So you sort of have to choose A or B. And I think most countries choose to have Islamism, even though most countries would agree it's not desirable, even majority Muslim countries, let alone European countries. But if you're not going to, I thought you were like disagreeing, but yeah, but if you're going to not have Islamism, then there's going to be limits on freedom of religion, and this is why I just draw a comparison, because we have cases in Central Asia. These are almost completely Muslim countries, and in general, Islamism is not allowed. And how do they not allow Islamism? In general, the governments have a big say in who runs the mosques. They have a big say on what is preached at the mosques. They have a big say on what books exist at the mosques. They have a big say on how Islam is expressed in public. So as you know, for Islamism, it's important for men to have a beard almost like mine. It's important for women to wear the hijab. And it doesn't mean in Central Asia they don't let women to cover their hair. They just don't let them do it in, like, say, the Muslim Brotherhood way. In general, they want you to cut your beard. And those are actually infringes on personal freedoms, too, like to have a beard or not. You can't in some Central Asian countries. And so, yeah, they don't have Islamism, and so they restrict personal freedoms and religious freedoms. And it turns out they actually don't really have terrorism issues. The Uzbeks who went to Syria went through Russia. And actually, the country that is the most liberal when it comes to religious freedom, Kyrgyzstan, is the one that by far per capita had the most people go to Syria. Yeah.
I was wondering if Milo could jump in. And there's a flip side to this. One is the ban, and that but there's also the idea of competition.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd respectfully disagree with the kind of zero-sum framing of religious freedom and Islamism, because it takes quite a state-centric approach to how you deal with Islamism. I don't think there's a choice about whether you want to respect religious freedom or Islamism, because Islamism is politicized ideology, and it's a politicized vision of Islam that sees a kind of central role for Islam in the composition of state law. And yeah, so on the one hand, I want to address Matt's point about competition and how certainly in Western countries there's a lot of civil society pressure that is geared against Islamism, and I think it's actually destructive sometimes when states themselves get involved in what's prescribing what is acceptable and unacceptable as an ideology. I think Salafi jihadism is plainly unacceptable because of its the fact that it entirely legitimizes violence, whereas there are a lot of political actors who see a kind of gradualist vision of Islamism. The Muslim Brotherhood is one notable example, who you might argue are kind of set against democratic means and the kind of the rule of law, but are not themselves violent and don't necessarily use violent ideologies. And I think that one thing to stress, you mentioned the case of Central Asia, and that is an example where there has been a kind of a very kind of kinetic approach to taking on Islamism by the state. But I think it's quite telling, and I'm not necessarily the kind of person that says you should read into every justification that's given by jihadi propaganda as to why something is the case, but one of the most prominent leaders in ISIS is a Tajik former special operations commander who went over in 2015. And in his call for further Central Asians to join, he really emphasized these points about a lack of religious freedom, the fact that people couldn't wear the dress that they wanted to, as means for coming to the caliphate, where they could, truly express themselves as Muslims. So it became a very powerful recruiting tool to attract foreign fighters. Because they, there was a perception that they couldn't practice their religion freely. So I think, I'd encourage us to be thinking about the contest against Islamism as a primarily civil society-focused one. We're not the messengers really to do it. This needs to be led by Muslim leaders, and there are plenty of Muslim leaders out there who are trying to contest this and these politicized ideologies. Whereas the contest against Salafi jihadism and counter-terrorism in particular is where the state has a more kind of active role to play.
Let's say I'm not advocating a policy position here. I was just doing an analysis, and that's why I was providing those two cases of Central Asia. The only thing I would just respond for the sake of discussion is, even in places that do allow complete religious freedom, ISIS will still say you still need to come to the caliphate because the government's still, kufar, kafir, and then I'll just bring up one other challenge, and maybe you can respond or we can move on. But in terms of countering Islamism in, say, the European context, there is definitely, civil society movements to counter Islamism. And I think because Islam is generally considered, I think the UK did a report on the Muslim Brotherhood where they said, Muslim Brotherhood is generally undesirable, but, it can exist. But there is also, movements that actually encourage Islamism too. So there's no guarantee that, you'll win the debate and say, Islamism is wrong. And in fact, I think, on the contrary, Islamism might end up winning the debate over the non-Islamism arguments. But I mean, in a democratic society, those are the debates that happen.
Let's make a final comment here. We'll move on to the next question.
Just one thing I would note is that just because you clamp down on Islamism one day doesn't mean it's sustainable in the long run. I mean, that's what Tunisia did for 25 years against Ennahda, and then Ennahda ended up winning the first election after there was a revolution. So if the Central Asian states were overthrown, I can guarantee you Islamism would come back just because people still sympathize with it, even if they might not publicly talk about it. So just because what's going on publicly doesn't mean that there's stuff going on behind the scenes in people's homes in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or wherever. So I think it's important to add that context too.
Very quick. I'll say, that's true. Islamism was going to take over parts of Uzbekistan after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was the government that clamped down upon it. That's the origin. So it's a challenging issue, and you're absolutely right.
Excellent. Meredith.
Bringing us back, sorry to flip again for a comment. In terms of how much CVE costs, and Steve, your comments brought me back to my 2.5 years in DC where I was only an expert at going to CVE meetings. But I would like to ask the panel, what can we do that's free? Because if memory serves, integration used to be a free thing. All my grandparents were immigrants to the United States. It was free. There were no government-sponsored projects to integrate them. And on the other side, what are we spending money on that we don't need to be, that's actually exacerbating the problem? So where could we cut, and of course this is a leading question, I clearly sort of have my own thoughts, but I'd love to know what your thoughts are. What could be free, where could we cut? And I would respectfully disagree about not proving prevention and M&E on this. Not having on the front page of the New York Times that there is a terrorist attack in New York City is going to make policymakers very happy. I think the lack of terrorist acts is proof enough that something's working.
Okay, so the question is, what can we do in the CVE realm that is free, and integration, etc. What CVE money that's currently being spent maybe doesn't need to be spent or as much spent, and revisiting the AM&E on proving prevention. Anybody want to start? Okay then.
I'll bite. since it was my
Stephen, we're throwing you under the bus. Go.
No, I mean, right, because I helped trigger the flashback. So, I mean, I think first it's important to understand, and I'm speaking from a U.S. perspective here in terms of when you're talking about like how we spend our money. That part of the problem with and this isn't really, this is, honest to God, not a hedge or a dodge. Part of the reason with trying to say what we can cut and what we can't cut is the fact that what counts as CVE from year to year, as you probably know if you're going to CVE meetings, changes. You know, I've got an anecdote in the book that I just come out from somebody who worked as a senior advisor on CVE who recalls having asked for a laydown of the budget for all CVE programming, and he described what he got back as a, quote, hair shirt, you know, that listed everything, including forward operating bases in Afghanistan under CVE, because at the time CVE was the shiny object, and so, right, everybody was categorizing things as CVE to get funding for it. You talk about rule of law as something that is CVE. Well, the United States has been trying to promote rule of law, and we've got people at the State Department who've been working on rule of law well before we had a thing called countering violent extremism. So I think to answer your question begins with sort of a much bigger issue of how are we going to scope what countering violent extremism is. And so I think that's where we need to start. I would say on the AM&E, I wholeheartedly agree with you that not having an attack on the front page is proof positive enough. I would add a couple of points to that, though. One is I'm a believer that we can do much better in terms of assessment, monitoring, and evaluation with regards to CVE than we do now. Yes, it's hard to disprove, you know, to a negative, this didn't happen, and so we can't measure it. There are proxy indicators that we can be using. Good assessment, monitoring, and evaluation begins not at the end of a project, but at the start of a project with a theory of change for how you're going to get to where you're going. You outline objectives, you outline a time horizon, you can look at indicators that you want to see along the way that show that you're making progress. All of those things can be done, should be done. The government is working on doing them. We're just not quite there yet, but I do believe that we could do more in terms of monitoring and evaluation. I think the problem is right now that what people who fund these budgets believe, or at least what they can see, is how many militants did you kill in a year? That's a metric that people can grasp. So when you go to Congress, they're like, well, we killed however many terrorists, and so body counts become your metric because we don't have good assessment, monitoring, and evaluation for CVE. And then the final point that I'll make, because I want to end with a positive recommendation for something that we could do that's relatively free, is do a whole lot more to promote civil society organizations in other countries and push back against governments that are clamping down on those civil society organizations. CVE is one of the few areas where non-state actors, civil society, can play a really, really big role. But unfortunately right now, in some of the places where CVE is most needed and where those civil society organizations could be most valuable and useful, what governments are doing is they are labeling what those organizations are doing as, quote, terrorism or extremism, which is ironic, and then clamping down on them. And so what's happening is, outside countries that want to be supporting CVE in places like Egypt are losing valuable partners on the ground. And so I would argue this doesn't cost a lot of money, but it does take a lot of political capital, is pushing back against that wave as much as possible to protect those organizations so they can do their jobs on the ground.
I'll just quickly add, first of all, I'll add that as someone's been doing CV for a long time, it's amazing how many times we have the same conversation. And I completely agree. We're making finally some really interesting progress on AM&E issues, but like this conversation's been going on for many years of this and many other conferences. I do think one thing is happening, both for good reasons and I'd argue some poor reasons, but is that CVE in the United States in particular is being pushed down from the federal level to state and local. I think that is largely very good. The reasons for it, some are good, some are not, but that is good. And what that does mean is that from a federal government level, we could be spending less money if we could figure out ways to provide proper seed money and then let things go. And we have some good precedent for that. For example, in Minneapolis. But you know, Lydia and others who've been working in some of these programs can remember that when, after the Boston Marathon bombing, when the federal government informed Boston, LA, and Minneapolis that there were going to be 3 pilot programs. They didn't ask them, they just said, hey, how are you? You're going to be a pilot program. We're giving you no money. We'll be back in a year to assess what you've done. And you can imagine how that was received, and you can imagine how well that went. So that doesn't work very well. I do think it also gets back really to the very heart of what is CVE specific and what is CVE relevant. I believe we need to be focusing on the CVE specific things for these types of funds, and we need to be having people who think with a CVE lens involved in the larger development conversations to be able to have that input. In other words, when we're deciding where to give our development funds for all the foreign assistance reasons we do this, one small reason should be, where are there CTCVE benefits, implications of doing this as part of that conversation? We have to stop calling building playgrounds in at-risk communities, in the United States or abroad, CVE. This issue of the shining object has been a real big problem. Those forward operating bases, people are saying, well, from those bases, we got people who are going out and talking to villagers, CVE. And that completely skewed things for quite a long time. I do think there's some progress there, but there's more that needs to be made.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's exactly the point I wanted to make. But maybe just to kind of pull it into more of a case study. So I'm going to flip the question about what is free and think more about what has broader utility. So, something that comes up in the prevention debate a lot is education, for instance. And, if you talk about CVE education, there's a lot of discussion about critical thinking, about understanding others' perspectives and so on, rolling out these programs around the world. But, I think that there's more framing that can be done about the broader impacts of these kind of things. In a 21st century globalized world, the importance of understanding, or kind of having empathetic approaches for the marketplace and for, kind of having the skills that young people need to thrive in a globalized world, I think is really important. And framing those in a wider sense, and I think it comes back to the CVE relevant point, can actually help to improve community buy-in. Because if you're targeting people and saying, well, you should be doing more to educate your young people against extremism, it's not necessarily going to be as well received as saying, we want to build these skills in people that are crucial for a variety of reasons. So I think that, and that comes back to your point about integration. This was something that was kind of seen as a gimme, and why can't we regain that? And why can't we kind of have a more positive set of values that we're standing for, rather than just what we're kind of trying to counter and target and prevent?
Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
It's primarily directed to Dr. Tankel. It's about Afghanistan, the future situation of a potential peace agreement, framework, whatever you want to call it. With the election of Imran Khan in Pakistan, I wanted to get your perspective on the likelihood of it being derailed, such efforts, particularly the U.S. strategy, and how can we prevent a potential breakdown of Afghanistan if the U.S. were to leave, prevent a similar situation as to what happened in Iraq?
Can you just repeat the question and then answer?
Sure. So the question was whether Imran Khan's election as the prime minister in Pakistan will have a negative impact on the potential for some sort of a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan at some point, and if the United States were to withdraw, how to prevent further destabilization and the collapse of the Afghan state, or return of Taliban and other militants along the lines of what we saw in Iraq with the Islamic State. Do I have that correct? All right. On Imran Khan, and for those who don't know, Imran Khan was recently elected as the prime minister of Pakistan. His election breaks the monopoly that the two parties and really two families had on the prime minister's office in Pakistan for many, many years now. For those who also, just as context, the military historically has ruled either directly after launching coups or indirectly behind the scenes, often in competition with whomever was sitting in the prime minister's office. Imran Khan is largely seen as the military's man in Islamabad, so I actually don't think that he has the potential to destabilize, or to throw a wrench into negotiations. I think, if anything, what we've now got, and I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about Imran Khan being in the PMO's office, but essentially he's going to do what the army wants him to do. And so if the army is ready to negotiate, and how the army wants to negotiate is, I think, in large part what Imran Khan is going to do. Now, he could potentially go rogue, but if I had to bet the money in my pocket, it would be on Imran Khan sort of towing the military's line. And I would just offer as an aside, I was in Delhi last week and talking to them about what Imran Khan's victory meant, and they actually saw it as an opportunity. They said for years we've been trying to talk to the Pakistanis, but there's a protocol issue. Our diplomats won't talk to, and our elected officials won't talk to their military, but their military sets policy. Now we can de facto talk to the army by talking to Imran Khan. So that's what I have to say there. In terms of how to prevent, Afghanistan from collapse, I have no good answer for you. And if you can find somebody with a good answer for you, then please point them in my direction. I would like to walk them down to 1600 Pennsylvania. I'll pay for their flight. There's this ongoing debate, right? Because when the Soviets withdrew, the Najibullah regime continued to hang on for a couple of years because it was funded. And it wasn't really until that money ran out that it collapsed. And so there's ongoing debate about whether the conditions look similar in Afghanistan now to then, and whether if the United States were to withdraw but continue to provide copious amounts of money, whether that would be sufficient to keep the government and the security forces able to keep the Taliban at bay. I don't know. And I think that one of the reasons, and you were asking why we're still in Afghanistan. I think one of the reasons why we're still in Afghanistan is nobody really wants to find out. And I was talking with a member of the audience yesterday, and we were saying, from a U.S. perspective, politically speaking, it would be really bad if there were a terrorist attack in New York that killed 500 people, and that attack came out of Syria or Somalia. It would be far worse politically if that attack came out of Afghanistan, especially after U.S. troops had withdrawn from Afghanistan. And so the political costs of not being there mean that we will continue to be there because we can't answer that question of how do you keep the country from collapsing, and because we don't know whether or not jihadists would flood back in. The hedge is still we're there for the foreseeable future to sort of manage the situation, even if any type of victory is going to prove elusive.
All right. Next question. Gentlemen, we've apparently answered every. Oh no, there's still one question left. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is directed to any of the persons. How do you separate, fight against terror, Islamism, jihadism? How do you separate? How do you draw the line between that and human rights abuses? I'm asking this because I'm from Nigeria. I'm in the army. I've done like several tours of duty in the Northeast, and one of the main issues we have is you try to liberate this area, and in so doing, a lot of things go wrong, and then not necessarily the U.S., but foreign governments come and say, hey, this is human rights abuse, and because of this, we are like pulling out these resources and all that, and then you're back to square one. So how do you separate that? Draw a line between that.
Yeah, the question is about how to separate human rights abuses from countering an insurgency. And the gentleman cited the case of Nigeria. And I'll probably defer to some of my colleagues, especially people in Israel, because Israel's also countering insurgencies and trying to separate human rights abuses while countering a group like Hamas. And I mean, it's very hard because a group like Boko Haram doesn't always wear uniforms, and they occupy a town, and you want to get Boko Haram out of the town, and you don't exactly know who's Boko Haram and who's not Boko Haram. And Boko Haram will give their weapons to a lady who will put them under her Islamic clothing, and she'll take them to another Boko Haram member, and then you capture the lady, and she might be carrying a baby, and then what do you do with her? She's carrying weapons to a Boko Haram member who's trying to kill you. Boko Haram maybe even massacred a town with those weapons last night. Do you arrest her, and then her baby lives with nobody? Or do you just let her go and then you say you can be a courier? So I mean, these are all the very, very complicated issues. One thing that I don't think has been recognized in the case of Nigeria is there's a lot of infrastructural challenges that I think affect the ability of Nigeria to meet human rights needs. And I'll give you one case study. In a remote part of Adamawa, they arrested some Boko Haram members from a camp. The hunters got them. They bring them to the local prison. And then where are they gonna, it's not even a prison, it's just a local police station. So what do you do with them? You transport them to a prison that's already full because you don't have enough prisons. If you take them to the prison, then there's not enough food in the prison for them. Then they starve in the prison. And then that's a human rights abuse. If you keep too many people in the prison, the Boko Haram breaks them out of the prison. So, I mean, you don't have enough infrastructure there to actually meet your human rights obligations. So you either let the Boko Haram people go free, or I don't even know what ended up happening to those 3 people. But maybe they violated human rights and killed them. I really don't know. But there's infrastructural problems there. One thing I think you can definitely do, okay, but 'cause there's these gray areas, let's just say, that even Israel deals with in its recent campaigns in Gaza. I mean, there are some blatant human rights abuses that I think can definitely be clamped down upon by better leadership. And that's the type of stuff we saw in the Cameroonian videos on the mobile phones, where you just take them and shoot them. And we've seen that in Nigeria too. Those are very blatant, and those are not even gray areas. And I think with better leadership, you can definitely reduce and maybe even eliminate that type of stuff that's not gray at all, where you just take people and shoot them. How to deal with the gray areas, I'll try to defer to my colleagues about how to distinguish between civilians and groups that are violent non-state actors in combat.
Eitan.
For me as an Israeli, it's a very complicated question, as you know. The first thing is that you need to educate your soldiers and your army to deal with these very, very complicated situations. This is one thing that you need to do. Second is to build the morale within the people that are dealing with this phenomenon. Third, you need a lot of lawyers. I'm not joking. I'm not joking, a lot of lawyers, because everything is connected at the end of the day to the international law. And everything that you feel yourself is under the component of international law, because you need to justify what you did, okay, in every place. And you need to minimize the collateral damage when you are dealing with this kind of phenomenon, and this is in the hand of the commanders. They need to decide, okay, what is the cost of my operation and what I need to do to win this situation, because it's very, as I mentioned before, it's very complicated. The enemy on the other side wants you to kill and abuse citizens, because at the end of the day, the areas of operation is not only in the field. The areas of operation today is in the global arena. What he needs is 1 picture, 2 pictures show what you did, and then everybody blame you, not blame them that they were the jihadists that carried out the attack. So it's you need to have, a process of education, understanding the situations, and the commanders, the leaders need to get the decision, a cost and benefit, of every operation. But it's very tough issues.
Okay, next question. Yes, in the back.
Sure. The American National Defense Strategy has tried to realign our position in the international system and rearrange our perspective of threats so that we're now focused more on great power than weak power. Under what circumstances, since you're all regional specialists, under what circumstances do you think a situation might arise where the United States or the West might have to consider a major military intervention in response to the emergence of terrorist threats?
Under what circumstances do you envision the United States considering having to engage in another large-scale military intervention, not for a great power threat, but for a terrorist non-state actor threat? That was a very loud silence.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I would just say, our minimalist intervention in Syria speaks volumes across two administrations of two different partisan flavors. And on the one hand, and I think that Stephen has articulated very, very well part of that, which is in some ways it's easy to get in and then very, very difficult to get out. And so there is certainly among voters in the United States a complete lack of appetite for another type of intervention like that. And there's a lot of people in the foreign policy community who feel that under the Obama and now the Trump administration is both. Maybe some leadership was needed because we could have prevented a lot of really bad things from happening in Syria, maybe, if we had intervened in certain ways that maybe wouldn't have involved, massive numbers of, or really necessarily any boots on the ground in Syria. That's a very hot debate, politically and substantively. But I think you're realizing, maybe more than some of the others in the room, I can see from the Cheshire Cat smile, just how sensitive a question that was. Steve?
Sure. So first let me say that as somebody who does write terrorism and counterterrorism primarily, in terms of my focus, when the national security strategy and national defense strategy came out and reprioritized great power conflict, I just thought, well, it's about time. So let me say that. And keeping in mind that the current occupant of the Oval Office is not entirely predictable, so it's always hard to say what might lead to another intervention. My sense is at this point, we're probably looking at a major terrorist attack against the United States that forces, politically, I think this president, but really probably any president, is going to be forced to respond, and then it's going to be, sort of degrees of response. Now, in terms of the size of the military intervention that one might see, I think that's going to depend, quite frankly, on what the contours on the ground look like. I think a major attack coming out of Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, places where the United States has had troops previously, and where there's not only an infrastructure that exists, but a history of putting troops on the ground, one might see a larger intervention there, surging troops back in. I think that might look different if the attack were coming out of the Sahel, where there's not that same history, also where terrorist groups don't necessarily have the same degree of control over territory, so I think that would potentially impact the nature of the response as well. And I think that is one reason why I'll come back to where I started in terms of, I thought it was about time when we transitioned. I would also argue that, having been intimately involved with sort of planning for what we thought our defense policy was going to look like in South and Central Asia, when we thought we were moving to a full withdrawal from Afghanistan, that however much the United States thinks it needs to do, it should perhaps be prepared to do a little bit more than that without overextending itself in order to try to prevent or at least be prepared to mitigate a crisis in these different parts of the world. Which is to say, I am wholeheartedly in favor of a pendulum shift towards a focus on great power competition, but that doesn't mean that you go to zero in terms of how you look at the counterterrorism problem. And that means having enough of a presence in different places and enough influence in different places where you can gather intelligence, where you can work through partners to try to prevent an attack before it occurs, or where you have people in place that you can mitigate the potential collapse of a country that could create the type of space that you had for ISIS to come back into Iraq, so that you don't have to go in nearly as heavy after the fact. Thank you for buying time on that one.
Yeah, I'm there for you.
If anybody has one last question, we have time for one last question, but we're also cognizant that we are the only thing standing between you and lunch, and that's a dangerous place to be. So it looks like we have no more questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming. Have a good lunch.